The Boeing 737 trembled through another pocket of turbulence, 37,000 feet above the Pacific. Most passengers gripped their armrests, but the woman in row 11 never looked up from her paperback thriller. Her fingers, steady as a surgeon's, turned another page while coffee spilled in the seats around her. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom, unusually tight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties with our navigation systems. As a precautionary measure, I need to ask if there are any military pilots aboard this aircraft." The cabin fell silent except for the drone of engines. 312 souls suspended in aluminum and prayer, suddenly aware of their mortality. Business travelers stopped typing. Families pulled children closer. The woman in row 11, auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, no makeup, wearing a faded University of Colorado sweatshirt, finally closed her book. Flight attendant Jessica Chen moved down the aisle, scanning faces with barely concealed panic. She'd been flying for 8 years and had never heard that announcement. Never heard that particular strain in Morrison's voice, like a wire about to snap. "Excuse me," Jessica whispered to the woman in row 11. "Did you hear the captain's request?" The woman looked up with eyes the color of storm clouds. There was something in those eyes, a depth that seemed to measure distances Jessica couldn't comprehend. "I heard." "Are you?" "Lieutenant Colonel Reese Hawthorne, United States Air Force. Retired." The words came out matter-of-fact, like ordering coffee, but Jessica caught the slight hesitation on "retired," as if the woman wasn't entirely convinced herself. Up in the cockpit, Captain Morrison stared at instruments that made no sense. His GPS showed them somewhere over Kansas. Impossible. His backup navigation system displayed Chinese characters he couldn't read. Co-pilot Williams worked frantically with the radio, catching only static and what sounded like foreign military chatter. "Sir," Williams's voice cracked like a teenager's, "I think we're not where we think we are." Morrison had flown commercial for 23 years. Desert Storm veteran, former Navy pilot, nerves like steel cables. But his hands shook as he reached for the intercom again. Below them, through breaks in the clouds, he glimpsed something that shouldn't exist. A landmass covered in snow, with mountain peaks that belonged to no chart he'd ever studied. The woman in row 11 stood up. She moved through the cabin with a predator's grace, past the desperate faces and whispered prayers. When she knocked on the cockpit door, her voice carried an authority that made grown men straighten their spines. "Captain, this is Lieutenant Colonel Hawthorne. Permission to enter the cockpit." Morrison's relief was audible through the reinforced door. "Granted." Passengers watched her disappear behind the cockpit barrier, their last hope wearing a Colorado sweatshirt and carrying the weight of secrets none of them could imagine. The navigation screens flickered with impossible data. Outside the windows, the world below looked wrong, ancient and hostile, like Earth from a different timeline. Morrison stepped aside as Reese Hawthorne studied the instruments with eyes that had seen war from 20,000 feet. "Colonel," Morrison said, voice barely steady, "can you tell us where the hell we are?" Reese's fingers danced across the navigation panel, muscle memory from aircraft that officially didn't exist. Her call sign had been Ghost for good reason. She'd flown missions that never appeared in any logbook over territories that weren't supposed to be on maps. Now, staring at readings that defied logic, she felt the familiar chill of the unknown. "Captain, I need you to maintain current heading and altitude," she said, her voice cutting through the cockpit's tension like a blade. "Don't make any sudden course corrections." Williams looked up from the radio, sweat beading on his forehead. "Ma'am, we're getting radio chatter on military frequencies. It's not English, not Chinese either. I've never heard anything like it." Reese slipped on the spare headset, adjusting the frequency with practiced precision. Static filled her ears, then voices speaking in harsh, guttural tones. Her blood went cold. She'd heard those sounds before, during a classified mission over the Arctic Circle 3 years ago, the mission that had ended her career and buried her so deep in black ops that even her own service record had been sanitized. "Ghost Leader, do you copy?" The voice in her headset wasn't one of the foreign transmissions. It was American, crisp, and urgent. "Ghost Leader, this is Watchtower. Please respond." Morrison caught the expression on her face, recognition mixed with something darker. "Colonel, do you know what's happening?" Reese keyed the radio with trembling fingers. "Watchtower, this is Ghost Leader. I'm aboard civilian aircraft, call sign. What's this plane's call sign?" "United 447, Morrison whispered. "Watchtower, Ghost Leader aboard United 447. Request immediate situation report." The response came through layers of static and encryption. "Ghost Leader, thank God you're alive. The portal opened 47 minutes ago. We have multiple bogies inbound from the anomaly zone. You're our only asset in the AO." Morrison stared at her. "Portal, what the hell is he talking about?" Reese closed her eyes, feeling the weight of classified knowledge pressing down like lead. The Thule incident, Project Bifrost, the things she'd seen through her F-22's canopy that night over Greenland, things that had made grown generals weep and physicists question reality itself. She opened her eyes and met Morrison's gaze. "Captain, I need you to trust me completely. What I'm about to tell you will sound insane, but our lives depend on your understanding." The radio crackled again. "Ghost Leader, be advised. We're tracking 6 unknown aircraft moving to intercept your position. Configuration unknown. Speed. Jesus, Ghost Leader, they're doing Mach 4 and climbing." Through the cockpit windows, the impossible landscape below began to change. The snow-covered peaks were giving way to something else, geometric patterns carved into the earth, too precise to be natural, too vast to be human. And rising from those patterns, 6 dark shapes climbed toward them like vengeful angels. Morrison's training kicked in despite his confusion. "Colonel, those aren't showing up on our radar." "They wouldn't," Reese said grimly. "They're not from our timeline." Williams dropped his headset. "Ma'am, did you just say timeline?" The first of the dark shapes broke through the cloud layer below them, and Morrison felt his worldview shatter like glass. It wasn't any aircraft design he'd ever seen. Flowing lines that seemed to bend light around them, no visible propulsion system, moving with an organic grace that defied physics. Reese was already reaching for the flight controls. "Captain, I need you to step aside. I'm taking the stick." "Ma'am, this isn't a fighter jet." "Trust me." Her voice carried the weight of authority earned in cockpits over hostile skis, in situations where hesitation meant death. "I've flown worse." As her hands closed around the yoke, something shifted in the cockpit's atmosphere. The uncertain civilian pilot was gone, replaced by a predator who had earned her callsign in the crucible of impossible wars. Ghost was back in her element, even if her element was a 737 full of terrified passengers facing an enemy that shouldn't exist. The radio erupted with new voices, military controllers vectoring unknown units toward their position. But mixed in with the familiar cadence of air traffic control was something else. Voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization, coordinating an attack that would be remembered as the day the sky itself went to war. The cabin behind them filled with gasps and screams as passengers spotted the approaching craft through their windows. But in the cockpit, Reese Hawthorne smiled for the first time in 3 years. She'd thought her fighting days were over. She'd been wrong. "Watchtower, Ghost Leader. I have visual on 6 bogies. They're beautiful in a terrifying sort of way." She paused, hands steady on controls designed for routine flights, not aerial combat. "Permission to engage." The pause from Watchtower stretched for heartbeats. Then, "Ghost Leader, you're in a civilian aircraft with 300 souls aboard. You have no weapons, no defensive systems, and you're outgunned 6-1 by aircraft with capabilities we don't understand. Copy all, Watchtower. Another pause. Ghost leader. Show them why they called you Ghost. Morrison watched in amazement as Reese's entire posture changed. Her breathing slowed, her movements became fluid, predatory. This wasn't the quiet woman from row 11 anymore. This was someone who had danced with death in the thin air above hostile territory and come home with stories that would never be told. The first of the unknown aircraft fired something that looked like liquid light. Reese threw the 737 into a dive that should have torn the wings off, pulling GS that made the engine scream in protest. Passengers in the cabin were thrown against their seatbelts, oxygen masks deploying as the aircraft bucked and rolled like a living thing. Ghost leader, your maneuver just defied about 12 laws of physics, came the amazed voice from Watchtower. Physics is more like guidelines when you're fighting for your life, Reese replied, pulling the aircraft into a climbing turn that had Williams throwing up into his sick bag. The pursuing craft moved like schools of fish, perfectly coordinated, anticipating her moves before she made them. But Reese had an advantage they couldn't calculate. She'd flown against their kind before, over the ice fields of Greenland, when the first portal had opened and changed everything the military thought they knew about the sky. She'd been Captain Reese Hawthorne then, call sign Ghost, the best pilot in a squadron of the best pilots in the world. They'd sent her through the portal in an F-22 modified with technology that officially didn't exist, to face an enemy that officially had never been encountered. She'd come back 3 days later with her aircraft shot full of holes and stories that had sent her straight into psychiatric evaluation. But she'd also come back with something else: knowledge of how they flew, how they fought, how they thought. Now, wrestling a commercial airliner through maneuvers that would have impressed aerobatic champions, she put that knowledge to work. The 737 wasn't built for this, but neither had the Wright Flyer been built to cross oceans. Sometimes you made do with what you had. Captain, she said to Morrison, who was white-knuckling his seat, I need you to get on the PA and tell the passengers to brace for extreme maneuvers. Don't sugarcoat it. Their lives depend on following instructions perfectly. Morrison's voice shook as he reached for the intercom, but his words were steady. 23 years of command authority took over. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are engaged in evasive maneuvers due to hostile aircraft. I need everyone to remain seated, seatbelts tight, and follow all crew instructions immediately. We have an experienced military pilot at the controls. In the cabin, Jessica Chen moved with professional grace through the chaos, checking seatbelts and calming passengers even as her own hands shook. She trained for hijackings, for bomb threats, for medical emergencies. Nobody had trained her for aerial combat at 37,000 feet against aircraft that looked like they'd flown out of humanity's darkest dreams. An elderly man in row 7 grabbed her arm. Miss, what's happening? Those things outside, what are they? Jessica met his eyes with forced calm. Sir, we have everything under control. The pilot is extremely experienced. It wasn't entirely a lie. Watching the cockpit instruments, seeing how Reese handled the aircraft with surgeon's precision even under impossible stress, Jessica knew they were in capable hands. Whatever those things outside were, whoever was really piloting their plane now, she projected competence that made even the most terrified passenger feel a flicker of hope. The radio crackled with updates from Watchtower. Ghost leader, be advised, we're tracking multiple portal openings across the Pacific. This isn't an isolated incident. Whatever triggered this, it's happening on a global scale. Reese processed this while throwing the 737 into another impossible maneuver, using the aircraft's size and momentum against the smaller, faster pursuers. They expected her to fly like a fighter pilot in a fighter jet. Instead, she flew like a fighter pilot in a 737, using every ounce of the big aircraft's mass and inertia as weapons. One of the pursuing craft overshot her turn, and she caught it in a textbook defensive split test that left it confused and out of position. For a moment, the roles reversed. The hunter became the hunted. "Williams," she said to the co-pilot, who had recovered enough to be useful, "I need you to monitor our fuel consumption. These maneuvers are burning through our reserves fast." "Yes, ma'am. At current consumption rate, we have maybe 40 minutes of flight time remaining." 40 minutes to save 312 souls, while fighting an aerial battle in an aircraft designed to serve peanuts and show in-flight movies. Reese had faced worse odds, but never with so many lives in her hands. The radio brought more grim news. Ghost leader, NORAD is tracking similar incidents over major population centers: San Francisco, Seattle, Vancouver. The president has authorized military response, but our fighters are having difficulty engaging the bogies. Translation: they were getting slaughtered. Conventional fighters, flown by conventional pilots using conventional tactics, against an enemy that had evolved beyond human understanding of aerial warfare. But Reese wasn't conventional. She'd been forged in the fires of classified conflicts, tempered by encounters with technology that existed in the gaps between official history. She'd learned to think like them, to anticipate their moves, to turn their own advantages against them. And now, 3 years after they'd buried her career to protect secrets that were apparently worthless, she was their only hope. The pursuing aircraft regrouped, their formation tightening with predatory precision. Reese could feel their tactical shift through her instruments. They'd stopped playing with her. Now they were moving to kill. She keyed the radio once more. "Watchtower, Ghost Leader. I'm going to try something that's either brilliant or completely insane." "Copy, Ghost Leader. At this point we'll take either." Reese pushed the 737 into a steep dive, engines screaming as the aircraft exceeded its design limitations. The pursuing craft followed, confident in their superior speed and maneuverability. But Reese wasn't trying to outrun them. She was leading them into a trap of physics and desperation. At the last possible second, she pulled the aircraft out of its dive with a violence that stressed the airframe to its breaking point. Two of the pursuing craft, caught off guard by the sudden maneuver, couldn't adjust in time. They collided with each other in a burst of exotic energy that lit up the sky like a dying star. 4 left, but the 737 was bleeding speed and altitude, and Reese could feel the aircraft's systems beginning to fail under the stress. Warning lights painted the cockpit in ominous reds and yellows. "Ghost Leader," came Watchtower's voice, tinged with amazement and growing desperation. "Whatever you just did, you need to do it 3 more times." Reese glanced at the fuel gauges, the stress indicators, the faces of Morrison and Williams. She thought about the passengers behind her, families going home, business travelers with meetings tomorrow, ordinary people who'd boarded an ordinary flight and found themselves in the middle of humanity's first contact with an intelligence that viewed them as insects to be swatted. She thought about her last mission, 3 years ago over the Arctic, when she'd flown through a portal into a realm where the sky itself was alive with malevolent intent. She'd come back changed, marked by experiences that had cost her career, her reputation, her sense of belonging in a world that preferred comfortable lies to impossible truths. But she'd also come back with knowledge. And now, as the remaining 4 craft closed in for the kill, she prepared to use every hard-earned lesson from that other sky, that other war, to protect the innocents who'd never asked to be soldiers in a conflict that spanned dimensions. The radio crackled one more time. "Ghost Leader, be advised. We're detecting massive energy buildup from the portal. Whatever's coming through next, it's big." Through the cockpit windows, Reese could see it, a distortion in the sky itself, growing larger by the second. Something was emerging from the tier in reality, something that made the 6 attackers look like gnats by comparison. She smiled grimly and pushed the throttles forward, coaxing every ounce of power from the failing engines. The final phase of the battle was about to begin, and Ghost was ready to earn her call sign one more time. The thing emerging from the portal defied description, part aircraft, part living creature, part geometric impossibility. It moved with the ponderous grace of a titan, its shadow falling across the Pacific like the hand of an angry god. Where its presence touched the sky, reality itself seemed to bend and flex. Reese felt the familiar ice-cold calm of combat settling over her mind. This was what she'd been trained for, what she'd lived through in that classified hell over Greenland. The impossible made routine through repetition and survival instinct honed to a razor's edge. Watchtower Ghost Leader, I have visual on. I don't have words for what I'm seeing. Copy, Ghost Leader. Neither do our scientists. Preliminary scans suggest it's the size of a carrier battle group and emitting energy readings that are off our charts. Morrison stared through the windscreen at the approaching monstrosity, his face pale as bone. Colonel, please tell me you have experience with something like that. Not exactly like that, Reese admitted, adjusting their heading to avoid the worst of the energy distortions rippling out from the massive craft. But similar enough. The key is understanding that it thinks differently than we do. Its tactical priorities aren't human. Williams, who had been quietly monitoring their increasingly desperate fuel situation, looked up with wide eyes. Ma'am, with respect, how do you fight something that size? You don't fight it directly. Reese's hands moved across the controls with practiced confidence, even as the 737 shuddered under the influence of exotic energies. You make it fight itself. The four remaining smaller craft had fallen into formation around their massive companion, taking up escort positions with military precision. But their attention was focused on the giant. They dismissed the wounded 737 as no longer a significant threat. That was their mistake. Reese had learned in the skis over that other Earth that these beings, whatever they were, possessed a hive-mind mentality. Individual units operated with perfect coordination because they shared awareness through their larger command unit. It made them incredibly effective in conventional combat, but it also created a vulnerability that human pilots could exploit. Cut off the head, and the body would thrash blindly. Ghost Leader, came Watchtower's increasingly urgent voice. We're reading massive power buildup from the large bogey. It appears to be charging some kind of weapons system. Through the cockpit windows, Reese could see energy crackling along the creature's hull, if it could be called a hull. Conduits of pure force raced across its surface like lightning trapped in amber, converging toward weapon ports that could level cities. She checked her instruments one more time. Fuel critically low, hydraulics failing, engines operating far beyond their design specifications. In any reasonable assessment, the 737 was a dead aircraft flying on borrowed time. But reasonable assessments had never been Reese's strong suit. Captain Morrison, she said, her voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them, I need you to make another announcement. Tell the passengers that in approximately 30 seconds, they're going to experience the most violent maneuver this aircraft has ever attempted. Anyone who isn't properly secured won't survive it. Morrison keyed the intercom with hands that shook only slightly. Ladies and gentlemen, in 30 seconds we will be performing an emergency evasive maneuver. Check your seatbelts, brace positions, and prepare for extreme forces. Flight crew, secure the cabin immediately. In the passenger compartment, Jessica Chen moved with superhuman efficiency, checking restraints and shouting instructions over the growing roar of stressed engines and exotic energy discharges. The passengers, beyond terror now, followed her commands with the desperate obedience of people who had accepted that their survival depended entirely on competence beyond their understanding. Watchtower, Ghost Leader, I'm going to attempt what we call a Jonah maneuver. The pause from ground control was telling. Ghost Leader, please clarify. We're not familiar with that tactical designation. It's not in any manual, Reese replied, lining up her approach vector with surgical precision. Sometimes you have to swallow the whale. What she was planning violated every principle of conventional aerial warfare. Instead of avoiding the massive enemy craft, she was going to fly straight into it, or more precisely, into the energy field that surrounded it like a lethal aurora. The field would either tear the 737 apart or, if her understanding of their technology was correct, disrupt the creature's ability to coordinate its escorts. The giant craft's weapons were almost fully charged now, energy building to levels that would vaporize their 737 in milliseconds. The four escorts had moved into attack formation, preparing to finish what they'd started. Reese pushed the throttles to their stops and dove straight toward the massive craft's core. The world exploded into light and sensation beyond human comprehension. The 737 entered the energy field like a bullet entering water, every system screaming as exotic forces played havoc with conventional electronics. But Reese had flown through this nightmare before, in skis where physics worked differently and survival demanded impossible skill. For 3 seconds that felt like hours, the aircraft tumbled through a space that existed between dimensions, where up and down had no meaning, and the speed of light was more like a gentle suggestion. Passengers screamed, metal groaned, and reality bent around them like putty in the hands of an angry child. Then they were through, emerging on the far side of the giant craft just as its coordination network collapsed. The four escort craft, suddenly cut off from their hive mind, began firing at random. Without their shared awareness, they couldn't distinguish friend from foe, target from threat. Within seconds, they had destroyed each other in a fratricidal fury of misdirected energy. The giant craft itself, robbed of its ability to process tactical information, began a slow, majestic death spiral toward the Pacific. Whatever passed for its consciousness was trapped in an endless feedback loop, unable to comprehend what had happened or how to respond. "Ghost Leader," came Watchtower's odd voice, "we're reading total elimination of all hostile contacts. How did you?" "Trade secret," Reese replied, fighting to maintain control of an aircraft that was more wreckage than machine at this point. "Now, about that emergency landing." The 737 limped through the sky on fumes and determination, every system pushed far beyond its limits. But they were alive, all 312 souls aboard, and the sky belonged to humanity once again. In the cabin, passengers wept and cheered and held each other with the desperate relief of people who had stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. Jessica Chen moved among them with professional composure, but her hands shook as she checked for injuries and offered reassurance. Morrison worked the radio, coordinating with air traffic control for an emergency landing at the nearest suitable airport. His voice was steady now, the confidence of a pilot who had been through hell and emerged with his aircraft and passengers intact. Williams monitored their failing systems, calling out readings that painted a grim picture of an aircraft held together by willpower and prayer. But somehow, impossibly, they were still flying. And in the pilot's seat, Reese Hawthorne sat with the calm satisfaction of someone who had remembered what she was born to do. The quiet woman from row 11 was gone, replaced by Ghost, the pilot who had saved the world without firing a shot, using nothing but skill, courage, and an understanding of warfare that transcended conventional thinking. The radio crackled with new transmissions as military units worldwide reported similar successes. The portals were closing, the invaders retreating or destroyed. Humanity's first contact with an interdimensional intelligence had lasted less than 2 hours, but it had changed everything. As the crippled 737 began its approach to an emergency landing, Reese allowed herself a small smile. She'd thought her war was over, that her fighting days were behind her. She'd been spectacularly wrong. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today, she had a plane to land and passengers to bring home safely. Everything else could wait. The runway appeared through the smoke and haze of a sky that would never look quite the same again. Ghost brought her wounded bird home with the same precision that had carried her through impossible battles in impossible skis, touching down so gently that the passengers applauded through their tears. As the aircraft rolled to a stop surrounded by emergency vehicles, Reese finally keyed off the radio and sat back in her seat. Morrison and Williams stared at her with expressions that mixed awe, gratitude, and a healthy measure of fear. "Colonel," Morrison said quietly, "who are you really?" Reese looked out at the sky, where the last traces of exotic energy were fading like aurora at dawn. Somewhere up there, portals were closing and realities were separating back into their proper dimensions. The war was over, but the peace would be different. Humanity now knew it wasn't alone in the universe, and that knowledge would change everything. "I'm the woman who was reading quietly in row 11, she said finally. "At least, I was until you asked if any combat pilots were aboard." She stood up and walked toward the cabin, where her fellow passengers waited to thank the pilot who had brought them through hell and delivered them safely home. They would never know the full story of what had happened above the Pacific that day, or understand the true nature of the forces they had faced. But they would remember the woman who had saved them, the quiet passenger who had become their guardian angel when the sky itself turned hostile. And in the years to come, when they told their children and grandchildren about the day the impossible became routine, they would speak of her with the reverence reserved for legends. Ghost had come home from her final mission, but her legend was just beginning. Years later, when military historians wrote about the Pacific incident, they would struggle to explain how a single pilot in a commercial airliner had defeated an interdimensional invasion force that had challenged the combined might of the world's air forces. The classified reports would speak of tactical brilliance, of unprecedented skill under pressure, of victory snatched from the jaws of certain defeat. But the passengers of Flight 447 would remember something different. They would remember the calm voice from the cockpit, steady as bedrock in a storm. They would remember the woman who had walked to the front of the plane with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the impossible before and emerged victorious. Most of all, they would remember that when the world needed a hero, she had been sitting quietly in row 11, reading a paperback thriller and waiting for destiny to find her. In the weeks following the incident, Reese Hawthorne found herself at the center of a media storm that threatened to expose secrets that were still classified at the highest levels. The Air Force moved quickly to manage the narrative, offering her a choice: return to active duty with a promotion and a new command, or disappear back into the civilian world with a pension, and the promise that her service would be quietly recognized in the halls where such things mattered. She chose a third option. 6 months after Flight 447 limped home from its encounter with the impossible, Colonel Reese Hawthorne opened the Hawthorne Institute for Advanced Aeronautical Studies at a small airfield in Colorado. The school attracted students from around the world: military pilots, civilian aviators, even astronauts preparing for missions to the outer planets. They came to learn from the woman who had redefined what was possible in the sky, who had proven that the only limitations were those imposed by imagination and fear. Her students didn't know about the classified missions, the interdimensional conflicts, or the true nature of the forces that had threatened Earth that day over the Pacific. But they learned to fly like she did, with precision, courage, and an understanding that the sky belonged to those brave enough to claim it. Jessica Chen visited the school once, 2 years after the incident. She found Reese in a hangar, working on the engine of a vintage P-51 Mustang that had been her grandfather's aircraft during World War II. "Colonel," Jessica said, watching the older woman's hands move with the same steady precision she remembered from that terrifying day in the cockpit. Reese looked up and smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely competent to genuinely warm. "Jessica, how are you doing?" "Better, the nightmares have mostly stopped." Jessica moved closer to the aircraft, admiring the restored warbird's sleek lines. "I wanted to thank you again for saving all of us." "You don't need to thank me," Reese replied, wiping her hands on a shop rag. "I was just doing what needed to be done." "No," Jessica said firmly. "You did something impossible. You saved 312 people using nothing but skill and courage. That deserves recognition." They stood together in comfortable silence, two women who had shared an experience that would bind them forever. Finally, Jessica spoke again. "Do you ever miss it? The military, I mean the excitement." Reese considered the question while gazing up at the Colorado sky, clear and blue and infinite. "I miss the certainty," she said finally. "In combat, you know exactly who you are and what you're supposed to do. Everything else is just noise." And now I teach people to find that certainty for themselves, to trust their instincts, to push beyond their limitations, to remember that the only thing standing between them and the impossible is their willingness to try. A student pilot walked past the hangar, practicing radio communications with the tower. Reese listened to the young woman's voice, confident, precise, unafraid, and felt the satisfaction that came from a job well done. "She's one of yours?" Jessica asked, nodding the instructor's approval. "Lieutenant Parker, formerly of the Navy. She's got good instincts, but she's too cautious, too worried about following procedures instead of trusting her judgment." "Sounds familiar," Jessica said with a smile. Reese laughed, a sound that transformed her from legendary pilot to approachable human being. "We all start somewhere. The trick is learning to let go of the fear and embrace the possibility." As Jessica prepared to leave, she turned back one more time. "Colonel, can I ask you something personal?" "Shoot." "That day on the plane when you walked into the cockpit, you weren't surprised by what was happening, were you? You'd seen it before." Reese was quiet for a long moment, her expression distant. "There are things in the sky that most people will never see, experiences that don't make it into official reports. Sometimes the impossible is just Tuesday in a different uniform." "Will it happen again? The portals, I mean the visitors." "Probably." Reese's honesty was refreshing in a world of comfortable lies and official denials. "But when it does, we'll be ready. Because somewhere out there, there's a pilot who's training for a day she can't imagine, preparing for challenges that haven't been invented yet." She gestured toward the young woman practicing in the pattern, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "And when that day comes, she'll remember that the sky belongs to those brave enough to claim it." As Jessica drove away from the Institute, she thought about the woman she'd met in row 11 and the legend she'd become. In a world that often felt chaotic and uncertain, it was comforting to know that there were still people like Reese Hawthorne, guardians who stood between ordinary citizens and the extraordinary threats that lurked beyond the horizon. Behind her, the sound of aircraft engines filled the Colorado sky as another generation of pilots learned to push beyond their limitations and embrace the impossible. And somewhere in that sound was the echo of a larger truth, that heroes weren't born in moments of crisis, but forged in the quiet dedication of those who chose to be ready when the world needed them most. The legend of Ghost lived on, not in classified files or secret histories, but in the hands and hearts of every pilot who learned to see the sky not as a limit, but as a beginning. 10 years after Flight 447, Captain Morrison published a memoir titled "The Day the Sky Changed." In it, he wrote about the quiet woman from row 11 who had saved his aircraft and everyone aboard. He wrote about her calm competence under impossible pressure, her tactical brilliance in the face of an enemy that defied understanding. But mostly, he wrote about the moment when she'd stood up in the cabin and walked toward the cockpit, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had always known that her moment would come and had spent a lifetime preparing to meet it. The book became a bestseller, spawning documentaries, dramatizations, and countless interviews with the survivors of Flight 447. But through it all, Reese Hawthorne remained largely silent about her role in the events, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. When pressed by reporters about her past, her classified missions, her training for impossible scenarios, she would simply smile and change the subject to her students, her school, her belief that the next generation would be ready for whatever challenges awaited them in the infinite sky. Because in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the legends of the past, but the preparation for the future. Not the glory of individual heroism, but the quiet dedication of those who chose to stand ready, day after day, for the moment when ordinary people would need extraordinary guardians. And high above the Colorado plains, where the sky stretched endlessly toward tomorrow, Ghost continued to teach new pilots to embrace the impossible and make it look routine. Because somewhere out there, beyond the blue, the next challenge was already forming, and when it came, humanity would be ready. The woman who had been reading quietly in row 11 had become something more than a hero. She had become hope itself. Proof that in a universe full of impossible things, the most impossible thing of all was the human capacity to rise above limitations and protect what mattered most. Her students would carry that lesson with them wherever their wings might take them, guardians of a sky that belonged to all those brave enough to claim it.